One of the beauties of the Sierra Club, I think, and what always kept my interest and why I stayed so long, is it's steadily evolving. That as issues change and politics change and scientific information changes, it's important for you to change the way you do things and what the focus is.
Coal isn't just a carbon monster, it is also a huge environmental injustice. It was destroying the oldest mountain range in the country, the Appalachian. And so you could see all these multitude of benefits in addition to the carbon, right? So it just sort of fit the whole package. You wanted to make change in the world, right? There was no bigger opportunity.
Actually, environmental justice doesn't even exist. You know, environmental racism and environmental injustice exists. We're working towards environmental justice.
I was equally fascinated by what does it mean to have a part of our country that everybody owns? What national parks belong to all Americans, and then also with the urban interface, how do you really design and develop a national park in a way that is responsive to community needs? And how do people in cities get introduced to nature without having to travel to a national park?
The take was, we've got to protect some of it. We've got to find a way to not develop everything. You know, not go the way of Los Angeles, grading tops of hillsides off and filling valleys and just putting housing everywhere. You know, there had to be a better way. And can you define communities by geographic landforms? Which Mount Diablo obviously is the prominent one in Contra Costa County.
A lot of people would still come up to me and say, you're my idol or something, you know. So that's nice, you know. I'm glad to be able to have that experience, not knowing that I would be that. I had no idea I would be the first Filipino. When I ran for office, I'm like, I just want to run for office so I can get this job done, right?
The most surprising thing for me in terms of accomplishment, and that was through the Board of Supervisors, was actually my work I was able to accomplish with providing senior services. And I think, you know, that piece was a pleasant surprise for myself that I grabbed onto it. The advocates that advocate for senior services, they grabbed onto me to be their champion, and I was able to be successful in that, I think.
The climb up the ladder. You know, and in that respect, let me quote one of my favorite friends at the time, which was Ernest Gallo. And he was kind of a regular contributor, friend, and I visited him once a year. And one year later on in my career, he said, Bill, I've been watching you and your friends since the Assembly, Senate, Attorney General, and how's it different? What do you see during this career climb? And I said, well, mostly you see people on parallel tracks in their career climbs and how obsessed they are with the climb, that climb, which makes me think that the world's run by crazy people. And he says, Bill, I've been up the ladder higher than you, and you do not know how right you are.
I'd say water is 10 times more complicated and controversial than climate change. When I carried some bills earlier than this that would require people to report how much groundwater they were using, you would think I was selling like secrets to the Soviet Union.
I was one of the two first Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, to be elected to the Assembly. There were a couple more Asian Americans before that. March Fong Yu was in the Assembly, and Albert Song was a state senator when I arrived there. But there were very, very few Asian Americans visible in Sacramento politics. In fact, I could also count the staff members on one hand.
Being a woman and a lawyer made it possible for me in the political world One, it gave me immediate stature with people who thought I was fluff. And two, it made it possible for me to not be intimidated or put off by people who were full of bluster and not that solid.
And it was so dangerous and so tight-knit, where if you were lucky enough to know a grower and then work very hard for that grower, maybe you were lucky enough to get a few tricks so you didn't have to spend the next 10 to 20 years falling on your face to get it right? Because it's a very finicky plant if you don't know what you're doing. It's very sensitive. It's hard. People think it says it grows like a weed. Not true.
I'm rather proud that I did not follow the forced march of my discipline, right? And that I decided for personal and intellectual reasons to do things that were heterodox and at the margin of my discipline, and at least as a topic and as methodologies not respected. And I ended up making a pretty good career out of being a dissident, if you like.
The remarkable thing about Jim's books are, I mean, we could talk about the impact, and every book that he has written since Moral Economy is a major intervention. It generated and spawned. I don't know any other social scientist for whom one could say that.
For me, it's the importance. There's such a lack of public awareness about Latino lives, about Latino history, that it's really important that whatever our venue to get the word out, and I think public history, it's really important.
Chicano studies, and by extension ethnic studies in general, has allowed us to see a diversity in the American experience where my generation growing up in public schools had no inkling of whatsoever.
And so I began to understand the importance of the whole social context of science, not just the history of momentum and energy on which I'd done my dissertation, but the whole idea that people who lived at that time were socialized into a worldview and a way of relating to nature that was much more integrated into nature and not just apart from it.
Every major rapper promoted these beverages. I mean, the recognition of something of these spirits among kids, right, is just, astounding. And this is for a population. Remember, I'm saying that Black youth, white teenagers, white young people were noted for alcohol use. Black and Hispanic kids were not. So this was like an untapped population for this kind of marketing.
We had all these huge banks lobbying and, talking to the Congress on a regular basis, donating money to them. And here there was with our little coalition and a few student groups out there saying that direct loans was really the way to go. And we won.
While my wife and I were occupying it, a group tried to burn down University House. We didn't appreciate that. And it turned out the lead person leading that protest was an arsonist from New York City. That's part of the challenge of being at Berkeley, right? Because we're like the epicenter of protests.
Right. I enjoyed Berkeley because it's freer here in California. There are fewer barriers. I could go on forever about the Brahmins of Boston and the freedom of Cal, but the faculty was broader, deeper, but surprisingly to me, very generous with their time. Collegiality seemed to be the hallmark of success.
What it is I really like to be with somebody who's better than me. Some people are more competitive and they just want to be better than everybody, and so they don't want to be near anybody better than them, right? And I kind of, when I think about it, I'm gravitated towards people that are better than me because, you know, you watch them and do what they're doing, right?
So he was giving me all this grief. I said, why can't I get insurance for my car? Well, we just want to make sure you're not running away from something you haven't committed any crimes. I said, do I look like I've committed some crimes or killed somebody, done something? Well, we're just going to make sure. So anyway, I finally found a place to live that was close, and I got my insurance, and I thought, how am I going to tolerate being here? And so then I thought, well, and I was the assistant chief there. So the chief, Carol Brown, she liked to travel and do various things. So we started going up to Washington, D.C. on weekends or Saturday to Wolf Trap. We'd go to the opera there.
This wonderful tenor who was in Katya was rehearsing Katya over on the rehearsal stage, and I get this call, so-and-so sick, he can't go on tonight. So I remembered that he was an American tenor, but he had spent part of his career in Holland. And there had been a touring theater that he had done Otello in that touring theater 8 years before or something. Anyway, I walked over to the rehearsal stage and pulled him out of the rehearsal, and I said, don't faint, but would you feel able to do Otello tonight? And he said, sure.
To me, writing and teaching about African American art was a mission. I was very, very clear about that. In the same way that once my brother told me about Black studies, that was a mission. And you asked about activism, and I think it's sort of ironic that I never considered myself an activist, and I still don't, because I think there's a real thing that is, and you know, I'm not Robin D.G. Kelly or somebody. But I felt a sense of real dedication.
I always remember Coltrane, when the band would stand around the bar, he'd be behind the curtain or downstairs practicing, never stopped, because he would hear things, I guess, while he was playing, and he could hear a different sound, another alternate chorus. And so when I should tell students, you know, it's not just one way. You have to decide. That's where you are, you know. You decide you want it to look more this way than that way. Mm-hmm. And that's where the art comes in.
Now remember, I am a very quiet, shy, painfully shy child. I just will not, you know, I'm just like, I don't like the world. I'm looking at the mirror. I'm dealing with my so-called disability. You know, I have to wear a prosthetic. I have to learn how to use the prosthetic. I'm a child. However, the prosthetic was not my fear, because I loved going to get a new prosthetic, because it was made in the old school tradition. And I would have to go to master glass artists, and I would watch them blow the glass. And I would be like, oh, this is so freaking real.
2021 was the year of of the 100-year anniversary of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Black section of town had been burned down and people had been buried in probably mass graves. And I mean, it just, the waves of grief wasn't just for Wakasa, but it was for like this endless landscape of buried stories. And the Japanese American story is just a small part of it, and a recent part.
And it wasn't until much later in the early 80s when the redress movement started that my parents really, opened up a little bit more about their experience and what they felt about it and stuff. But it wasn't until the redress movement came about, and people, Niseis and Iseis at that time, really started opening up and speaking about what they went through.
Secretary Howe begins with the assumption that a person's
a person's writing ability reflects that person's thinking ability. I don't begin with that assumption. Instead, I turn it into a question. And the question is, to what extent does a person's writing ability reflect that person's ability to think?
My sister and I heard of this opportunity to go with a group of, I don't know, maybe 30 to 50 other Japanese Americans. And so we asked my mom if she wanted to go. She was, I guess, in her 80s then. And her response was no. I have no desire to go back.
I mean, I know there's been obvious, sort of suppressed grief over the losses I've had, in my own life of my parents and my siblings. But then, even to think, well, how much of who I am is actually carried over from what my mom went through or my dad. And so I do think, again, the more one explores, even though it might be a difficult process, that it's always kind of a path to healing. It's kind of like when you have to open a wound to clean it out and then it heals over eventually. So yeah, I'm actually quite hopeful about that. And I hope, if individual people are doing that as on an individual level, then that must mean add up to a collective healing.